Welcome, first of all, to all of you who have joined us today for this Glaucoma UK seminar. Today's seminar is about digital support. It's about glaucoma eye tests, and basically why we go for the eye tests that we go for when we go for glaucoma eye tests and what they tell us. Our guest speaker today is Lisa Cowan. Lisa Cowan is a hospital optometrist at Falkirk Community Hospital, and she's also a senior specialist glaucoma lead for NHS Education Scotland. Before starting, just going to talk you through how Zoom works. It's very important that you know that we can't hear or see any of you, okay? So if you want to be able to communicate to us, you need to do it through text. And the way that you do that through Zoom is at the bottom of your page, you should have a bar. And in that, there's something called Q&A. And what you need to do is if you want to ask us a question during the session, you just need to write your question into that box. I'll be keeping a close eye on that box, and at the end, we'll then be putting questions to Lisa. Even if you don't write a question, if you see a question coming up and you think, oh, I like that question, that's a good question, you can click like next to the question. That then raises the question up the hierarchy and means that I know that there's more than one person that's interested in that response. The next thing you'll see is you should see mine and Lisa's faces throughout this presentation. If our faces are appearing in front of the slides or you can't see the information behind it, you can click on our faces and kind of move us around the screen, just so you can then see all of the text. Just so you know, this session is also being streamed live on Facebook today. And if you're watching on Facebook, you can also ask us questions. All you need to do is comment in the Facebook feed, then that information will come through to us and we'll hopefully get to your question. There'll also be two polls launched during this webinar. This will help us to see if these sessions are having a difference. So I'm going to launch one in just a second, and it will really help us to understand if you're learning things. Finally, in this point, if you're having any technical difficulties, obviously it's very difficult for us to work them out on this particular webinar, but some of the more common things you can do is perhaps check your Wi-Fi, first of all, and if that seems okay, maybe restart and then come into the Zoom seminar after that. Okay, I'm going to very quickly start the first poll, and I'm going to launch it now, and what I want you to do is have a really quick look at this and answer the questions just as easy as you can by running your cursor over. I'm going to leave this open for a couple of minutes, and as I said, I'm going to do another one at the end. Just to tell you a little bit about who we are. We're Glaucoma UK, and we are the UK's only charity for people with glaucoma. We work in three main areas. Firstly, we work in campaigning and awareness. We want people to know what glaucoma is and the importance of getting your eyes tested. The earlier glaucoma is diagnosed, the less likely people are to experience sight loss. Secondly, we provide support and information to people who have glaucoma and also those who care for people with glaucoma. We have information leaflets, we have a helpline, a buddy service where you can get peer-to-peer support, and we also have an online patient forum. All of our services are provided free of charge. Finally, we help to fund research into the diagnosis, treatment, care and prevention of glaucoma. Now, we don't have huge amounts of money to put into research, but what we do have often goes into seed funding and starting up initial projects. Really gets them going at the early stage. And we're funded entirely by the generosity of our members and our supporters. Okay, thank you so much. I can see you're all looking at doing that poll, which is absolutely wonderful. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty of it. Now I'd like to introduce Lisa to start sharing her presentation and get going on today's talk. Thanks, Lisa.
So, yeah, I'll start by saying that I'm in Scotland, as we've already established. I work in Falkirk and in Glasgow, so I'm aware that this is a UK-wide event, which is great. I'm also aware that I talk a bit funny and I have a tendency to talk quite fast once I get started, so hopefully Philip will keep me in check and I'll try to restrain myself and speak at a reasonable pace. As Philippa said, I'm an optometrist. I have two different jobs. I work in a hospital eye clinic, including a glaucoma clinic. I have a particular interest in glaucoma, and my other job is teaching other optometrists about glaucoma, as if I didn't get enough of glaucoma in my first job. So I have a very glaucoma-based job, and I was delighted when Philip asked me to do this. I like talking about glaucoma, and I like talking to patients. I like talking to my patients, but I don't always get enough time to do that. So it's lovely to be here and be able to not quite talk to all of you, because you can't talk back, but you can send your questions in, and it's always nice to have some interaction with people. So I have hopefully covered a whole range of things. I had a good think about what to cover. Philip had asked about this test that we do in the glaucoma clinic, and the test that you get when you go for your visit. And when I was thinking about how to do that, I thought probably in my head I was thinking about it as the patient journey, as it's trained me to call it. So just thinking about from when you step into the clinic for your appointment, a bit different these days from what it used to be. But when you come in, just thinking about each person you see, each test you have done, and what that might look like. And there will be some variation depending on your local arrangements. Everywhere's set up differently, physical clinics are different, and staff have different ways of working. But I think there'll be a lot of it that's common to all of you, or most of you, and to where I work. So I thought we could just have a think about that. So we have a few slides just to, oh, she said, and now they're not moving. There we go. So the first thing that occurred to me was, before we even get to the tests, is all the people. I am regularly asked, what do I call you? What's your name? Who are you again? What did you say you were? And I think that's, eyes are particularly confusing because everything starts with an O, which isn't ideal. And there's lots of different people with lots of different titles. And I think it's confusing sometimes for us, and I imagine it must be quite confusing as a patient, especially when you might see different professionals and different people at different visits, which I know is something we get in terms of feedback. People are sometimes feeling that they're not seeing the same person each time, and there are often good reasons for that, but it can make things a bit more difficult. So some of the people that you might see, almost all of whom start with an O, are the ophthalmologist, who is the doctor, the eye doctor, often a consultant, but there are junior doctors as well who you may see in your clinic. And traditionally, that's who most glaucoma patients would have seen in the eye clinic, but that's no longer the case, really, as we've moved into other professionals that have taken on some of those roles. There's a bit more variety around who you might see in the clinic. And you might see more than one of these people, or you might just see one, again, just depending on the sort of individual setup. So we have the ophthalmologist, we have nurses who don't start with an N, but they're often ophthalmic nurses, so then they do start with an O, so they still fit in the O family. And nurses don't tend to study a lot of eyes at an undergraduate level. They study general nursing, but when they come to work in the eye clinic or an eye theatre, they do a lot of additional training on the job, and sometimes sort of formal courses as well, and learn a lot more about eyes there. Orthoptists, generally they train a lot in sort of eye muscles and eye movements and in children, but in more recent years a lot of orthoptists have moved into other roles as well, including glaucoma, so you may well see an orthoptist in your visit to the glaucoma clinic as well. Optometrists, like me, used to be called opticians, so that's another area of confusion. The optometrist that you see in the hospital has the same qualifications as the optometrist that you go to for your regular eye examination. Sometimes we can have additional qualifications, but then the optometrist that you go to for your glasses may also have additional qualifications. There's lots of different things that we can do, but we have the same basic qualifications. And some optometrists, both in the community and in hospital, also have additional qualifications in prescribing, which allow us to prescribe medications, including those for glaucoma, and that allows us to manage glaucoma more effectively. And the other person that you may often see, and actually very often the first person you see when you go to the clinic, is an ophthalmic technician or a healthcare assistant, and they're often the first person who would sort of take you in and will measure the vision test when you're reading the letters, which we'll talk about. They will often do your visual field tests. Sometimes they'll do scans and photographs as well. So they do a lot of the information gathering often before you see anyone else in the clinic. So that's the first person that you're seeing. So there's a lot of different people, and often you'll see multiple people on a visit, and that's sometimes why it takes a wee while to get your eyes tested, but particularly in the glaucoma clinic, there's there's quite a lot to do. There's a lot of information to gather, and it's hopefully all worthwhile, as we'll come on to discuss later. It all forms part of the big jigsaw puzzle that we're trying to put together to work out how best to care for your eyes. So now that we've got all the people out the way, any questions on any of this, just send them in and we can come back to any of these things later on if there's anything that you want to clarify, but I shall keep going for now. So the first thing I've covered is not a specific glaucoma test, it's an eye clinic test, and it's the measurement of your visual acuity. And in every service that I've ever worked in, this is measured every time on every eye that steps into the clinic. And I think sometimes patients find that a bit tiresome, and I think that's understandable, especially if you're coming very regularly and you've just had it done and it's another, you're waiting to have it done. But it is important. The reason that we do it is not specific to glaucoma, as we've said, and many of you will know that glaucoma doesn't tend to affect central vision. Certainly in the early stages, most people can see very well down the chart if they don't have other eye problems. But it's a really useful test for us to do, because even if you have glaucoma, unfortunately, it doesn't make you exempt from developing other things. So it can help us to gauge whether our glaucoma patients are developing some cataract or any other problems that we need to investigate. It helps us to determine whether we need to give you specific advice about driving. So it's a really useful thing to do, and it's a good indicator of the sort of general state of the eyes. So we do that on every patient who walks into the clinic, just so that we've got that recorded. So the way we do it is we measure it at distance. So usually, sometimes there's confusion because you're reading, people aren't sure which glasses to wear, so we wear reading glasses. And, making sure you take all your glasses with you to the clinic is usually a good policy, but we tend to do this test with your distance glasses on. So whatever you wear for television or for driving are the glasses that you would wear to read this chart. We do one eye at a time, because again, that's important information. You can have one eye that's seeing very well and another one that's struggling, and you don't always notice that until you cover the good one up. So it's always important for us to measure each eye on its own. And we're looking to measure the smallest level that you're able to see. And for that reason, we will, if we're doing this properly, we will push you to try things that are maybe a bit too hard and maybe that you feel that you can't manage. But for us to really measure it properly, we need you to get some wrong. If you haven't got any letters wrong, then we probably haven't read down far enough. So if we're pushing you, again, it's for a good reason. It does only measure your central vision, so it doesn't tell us anything about peripheral vision, which we'll come to later, and which is obviously a big deal in glaucoma. So it's not a particularly sensitive or useful test in terms of knowing if there's been any change in your glaucoma, but it's still a useful test for other reasons. It also doesn't tell us anything about the quality of vision. I think that's important for us to acknowledge. Even if you can see down to the bottom of the chart, it's not always an indication that your vision is perfect. And sometimes, as many of you will be aware, you can still have bits missing, or the quality is not quite right, or the letters are a bit distorted, and we are aware of that, but we still want to know what the smallest line is that you can see. It also doesn't check the prescription in your glasses. We can't tell you from doing this test whether you need new glasses or not. It would be great if we could, but it's not a thorough enough test for that. So it is always important to continue with your regular eye examinations and get that tested in full, and having this test at the hospital doesn't replace that. So that's this visual acuity test out of the way. And once that's done, we get on to the more of what would be considered the sort of glaucoma test. And I've put the three tests as something that often comes up, and I think that's something that I've seen probably from Glaucoma UK as well, for patients to be aware of. There's sort of three specific tests that tend to be associated with looking for glaucoma and monitoring glaucoma, and those are the pressure, which you're probably all aware of. That's the one that people tend to be very much aware of, and a lot of people know what your pressure has been. I have patients who record their pressure religiously and ask lots of questions about it, and others who are just happy for us to record it in their notes and to let them know what we think. But pressure is the sort of single measurable number that we can use to monitor glaucoma. We also have the visual field test, which again you'll be familiar with, measuring your peripheral vision, and we have the examination of the optic nerve. And those three things together are the sort of three main parts of the picture that traditionally we've used to diagnose glaucoma and then to monitor it for any sort of deterioration over time. So those, certainly the pressure and examination of the optic nerve, you would expect that they would almost always be done on every visit. The visual fields, not necessarily, but they tend to be done quite regularly as well. So these are the tests that you would be expecting to have fairly routinely on your eye clinic visits. And we'll have a wee look at each of those and just talk a little bit more of each of them in turn. At the bottom though, I've added a few other things. So there are the sort of tests that we do every time. There are also some tests that we'll do in a first visit. A lot of you will maybe remember or be aware that when you go for the first time to the glaucoma clinic, it takes even longer than your follow-up visit. It can be quite a long appointment because there's quite a lot to do. Glaucoma is a complex disease. We have lots of questions to ask you about sort of history and some of the risk factors we need to check. And we also have a lot of tests that we gather as what we would consider sort of baseline information. So things that we don't need to do every time. Some of them we may never need to do again, but they're part of this sort of basic information that we want to have at the start to try and make a decision. So those are things like the chemistry measuring the corneal thickness. We do OCT scans, are a relatively recent thing. So in the past, we've done sort of photographs of the optic nerve. We're now able to do scans, which take some measurements of the back of the eye and give us a bit more detail. We have gonioscopy, which is when we look at the angles of the eye. So that helps us to determine whether you have open or closed angle glaucoma. And again, that's something we would do at the first visit to try and determine, and we may do it again in the future if it's needed, but it's not something that we do every visit. So there are some additional tests. I've not gone into those in so much detail. I've concentrated really just on the three tests that we mentioned there, because those are the most common ones and the ones that you're most likely to have done on your regular clinic visits. So this will be probably a familiar picture to all of you who've had pressure measured. There are other ways of doing it, but this is the most common. So when we talk about the pressure, we are quite literally measuring the pressure inside the eye, just like you would measure the pressure in a tyre or measure the pressure in anything else. There's fluid inside the eye and it sits at a level of pressure, and we can measure that by pushing on it essentially. It's not very technologically advanced. So what you can see in the pictures there is Goldman applanation tonometry, which is what tends to be used in glaucoma clinics. So we put some anaesthetic into the eye along with some fluorescent yellow dye, which is why the picture in the bottom right glows green there. We then use a calibrated instrument to push against the surface of the eye, against the cornea, and to just gently flatten the eye, flatten the front part of the eye just for a moment, and that allows it to take a measurement, and then we can take it off again. So it's a fairly easy test to do, certainly from our point of view. It might not be quite so easy from a patient point of view, but we try to make it as pleasant and as quick as we can. Things that are worth knowing about the pressure itself is that it does always fluctuate, and sometimes patients can get I've got a few patients who get quite anxious if their pressure's gone up by sort of 1 point from the last time, and we spend a bit of time just discussing how fluctuations are normal. It would be unusual to consistently get the exact same number at every visit, and going up by 1 point or 2 points is often not significant. So the numbers are important, but it's also important not to get too hung up on the numbers and the small fluctuations, because some degree of that is normal. So it all needs to be sort of interpreted as part of the bigger picture. And the other thing that's worth knowing is that probably the question that I get asked more than any other is, what should the pressure be? And as you often find with these things, you won't get a straight answer to that, because there isn't a correct answer to that. Much as we'd love to say, well, it's X. It would make my life much easier if all we had to do was just keep everyone below X, but that's not how it works. The right pressure is entirely individual for each person's eye, and essentially the right pressure is the one at which your glaucoma doesn't get worse. And that is different for each individual person, and there's lots of things that sort of feed into that. So there's not a specific number that we're aiming for. It's a bit more complicated than that, as things often are in medicine. Things are more complicated the more you find out. So the picture you can see on the bottom left there, that probe that just comes towards your eye. So you'll all be used to sitting on the patient side of it, but from our side, you just see that we're sort of pushing that probe towards the eye, touching gently on the surface. And what you're maybe not so used to seeing with the picture on the right, that's our view as we're looking through the instrument. And what we're trying to do is just to get these two green semicircles aligned like that. And that tells us that we're just the right pressure to applanate that eye. So that's when we step back and take the reading off. That's the pressure. And then the visual field test. I kind of feel if there was any audience feedback here, I'd be getting a big groan at this point, I think, and a pantomime groan would be appropriate here for visual field test. It's not any patient's favourite test, I don't think. It's a difficult test to do. I've done it many times, we've all done it, and I think it would be impossible to qualify as an optometrist without having had your visual field done. So we do understand that it's difficult, and we understand what we're asking of you. And as soon as someone invents something better, we'll stop, but as yet they have not. So the visual field test, as you may well know, maps your peripheral vision, which is what we need to know about in glaucoma. So as we said, the central vision, measuring the letters, doesn't really tell us very much about the effects of glaucoma on your eyes, because the central vision and your ability to read is not usually affected by glaucoma until quite late on in the disease, whereas the more peripheral vision further out is affected earlier. So it's really important information, particularly in picking up early glaucoma or picking up change in the sort of earlier stages. So when we are testing the visual field, you're asked to look at a central point and to keep your eyes still, and then we flash lights in your peripheral vision and ask you to press a button when you see them. And what that then does, I've got some of the printouts that I can talk you through on the next slide, so we'll come back to that, but it essentially gives us a map of what you're able to see, so how bright the light had to be in each area for you to see it. So there'll be some areas where you can see it when it's quite dim, there'll be other areas where it has to be a bit brighter, and it gathers all that information and feeds it through a smart computer, and then gives us a nice printout and a map that we can actually make sense of. So the lights vary in intensity, they can be very bright or very dim. There are some versions of a visual field test where the lights are always bright, and often that's what you'll have done when you get your eyes tested by optometrists. They're what tend to be called screening visual fields, and they're much, much easier to do than the ones that we typically do at the eye clinic, which doesn't make me anyone's favourite person. So people come in and go, so I did that test with my eyes tested, but it wasn't nearly as bad as that. And that's why the test that we're doing is specifically looking at glaucoma. It's quite a detailed test, and that makes it, unfortunately, harder from a patient's point of view, but it does give us a lot more useful information. It gives us essentially a number, so for each of the little points where you see a light, it gives us a number which measures how bright the light had to be before you were just able to see it. It doesn't, if you miss one, and again, this is some patients are more prone to this than others, but some people sort of panic if they weren't fast enough on the button and they maybe missed one and they're worried that they've messed the test up. It does go back and check again, and you're not going to give us a completely useless result for having missed one light. So we appreciate that it's human beings we're testing, and no one is able to do this test perfectly. I certainly can't. So don't panic if you make a mistake. The test has an element of that sort of built in. It knows that people aren't going to get it 100% of the time, and it will go back and check. Once you've finished the test, the computer inside the machine then compares what you saw to what it would expect for someone of the same age. So we have to tell it what age you are before we start, because there are some changes of age as well. So it does lots of fancy calculations to try to compare it, and then it tells us how you did compared to how we'd expect someone of your age to have done for each point. And we then get, when we look at those maps, there are different patterns you can get. They're not all related to glaucoma. You can get different patterns with different things. You can get some different patterns in stroke and other kinds of eye disease, but there are specific patterns that we tend to see in glaucoma that are very characteristic. So we have an idea of what sort of patterns that we tend to be looking for. And although it is difficult, it is a really valuable test, because it's unlike the pressure or looking at the optic nerve or some of the other tests that we do. The visual field is a measurement of what you're able to see. So it's a sort of visual function test, and it's probably the element of your glaucoma that has most of an impact on your life and what you're able to do. So when the visual field is affected, some of you will be aware that at some point, visual field defects can affect driving. They can affect your ability to sort of move around or to see things in your peripheral vision. And those are all really important things. So it's a very important test, I think, from a patient point of view, because it gives us information that's really important about your vision and what you're able to do with your vision. So it's arguably one of the most important tests that we do. So thinking about just what I was saying about the maps, you've probably seen something like this in your notes, whether you've had a chance to actually look at it close up before, I'm not sure, some of you will. So we have, this is the visual field printout, so each time it's one for each eye. So this is a left eye on this side here. This is a full field, so this is a normal visual field. We've got a little black bit here, which is the blind spot, which everyone has. Each eye has a blind spot, which is just where the optic nerve is. So you don't see light when it's in your blind spot. If you do a visual field test and you don't have a blind spot, then that tells us that the test doesn't make sense. So everyone should have a blind spot somewhere around here. So you can see there's this dark area. The darker the area is, the worse it was, if you like. So the blind spot, we'd expect not to see anything. The rest of this is all fairly uniform, so there's no other dark spots there. It's otherwise quite light. This test down at the bottom, again, we're looking for little black dots in here that would sort of highlight to us that there was an abnormality, and there's nothing there. So that would be a healthy full field, and we'd be happy with that one. The one on the other side here is an eye with glaucoma. So again, we've got a blind spot. This is a right eye, so the blind spot's over to the right here on the other side. It's maybe a bit bigger in this eye. There's some other dark spots up here. We've also got some dark areas at this side up at the top, and we've got another dark area right in the centre here. And these are both, this area just over to the side and this area in the centre are two of the areas where we do see defects of glaucoma. So that would sort of fit with some of the patterns that we would expect to see. And what we would then be looking for is looking at that test and looking back at the patient's last test from the year before to see if it was any worse, because as you'll be aware, we can't make glaucoma better. What we're aiming to do is to stop it from getting worse. So we'd be looking to see if there was anything new on there or anything that has got a bit worse since last year, or if it just looked exactly the same, which would be reassuring over time. So that, I think, covers the visual field testing, and I'm happy if anyone's got any specific questions about these, we can always come back through the slides if you want to ask anything at the end, but I think that covers those for now. The optic disc assessment, you'll have seen some of these photographs as well. So the optic nerve is often described as the cable wheel, an electrical cable that connects your eye to your brain. So it's the only bit of your brain that you can see from the outside by looking in through the eye. So you've got this sort of cable that goes back out of the back of the eye and joins up to the brain, and the optic nerve head is at the end of that. So this yellow sort of disc that you can see here is this sort of head-on end of that cable of the optic nerve. And that is where we tend to see damage in glaucoma. So when we're looking with the sort of bright lights and you're sitting on the microscope and we're having a look in with lenses, this is generally what we're looking at, and we're looking for signs of glaucoma there. So what you can see on the left is what we would class as a healthy, normal optic nerve. So it's all quite sort of orangey pink here. We've got a sort of slightly paler yellow bit in the middle, and that's where it's sort of pushed back. That's called the cup, just in the middle here, but the cup's quite small. Everything looks quite pink and healthy, and we would be quite happy with that one. In the middle, we've got an optic nerve head that's a bit more questionable. There's sort of pink bits around the edge here, but there's a bigger pale bit in the middle, and we're starting to see that cup looking a bit bigger and a bit more pushed back. And on the right, we can see an eye that clearly has glaucoma and is really quite damaged and unhealthy. There's almost none of that sort of nice healthy pink surround left, and it's really all white and pale, and you can sort of see there where the blood vessels go over, everything's just been sort of pushed back where it's got damaged. So there's a huge range of variation in glaucoma. So, oops, there we go. So we have anything from healthy on the left to definitely not healthy on the right to somewhere in between. And that's just two pictures. No two optic nerves are the same, even between your right eye and your left eye. You know, between siblings, between twins, they're never identical. And one of the tricky things when we start looking at optic nerves, not even specific to glaucoma, but just when we start learning to look at optic nerves at all, it's just there's a huge amount of variation. Just like anyone, if you look at people's noses or people's eyes or people's fingers, everyone's just built a little bit differently, and there's so many sort of variations on what a normal optic nerve can look like. They can be different colours, different shapes, different sizes. So it takes a lot of practice to work out what the normal ones look like, and then we need to start looking for signs of glaucoma or other diseases as well. So there's a lot of different things for us to be thinking about. You'll also see things like in the middle here, down at the bottom, is a sort of red bit there, which is a wee hemorrhage, a burst blood vessel, which we can sometimes see in glaucoma as well. So there's lots of different things for us to look for. So we will always want to be having a good look at the optic nerve each time in your clinic to look to see whether it's changed from previous times, because we're always looking for change. And if there's any sort of signs of glaucoma there, if we've not already identified glaucoma, or that anything that would indicate that the glaucoma is getting worse, that might be a hemorrhage or a change in the shape or something like that. So we would always be having a good inspection of the optic nerve. Sometimes that involves putting dilating drops in, which again is not entirely convenient, but is sometimes necessary, especially if you have a bit of cataract. We need to put some drops in which will blur your vision for a few hours, just to get a good look, to make sure that we're seeing everything that needs to be seen. And also that will sometimes let us take a better photograph or an image of the back of the eye as well, which would be really useful. So that's the optic nerve assessment. And just a wee bit about some of the other tests that we do. I've not gone into so much detail on this, but gonioscopy, you can see this is one that we tend to do at the first visit, and then just if it's needed thereafter. And that's what you can see in this photo down at the bottom. It's a lens, it's called a contact lens, but it's not a contact lens as you would know it. It's a contact lens because it makes contact with the eye. And the edge of that lens is just sitting against the patient's eye there, and we're looking through the lens at the front, and it allows us just to check the drainage angle of the eye for any narrowing or blockages, which can be an indication of angle closure glaucoma. So you may well be aware already, some of you may know which type of glaucoma you have. The vast majority of people that we see have open angle glaucoma, but some of our patients have some form of angle closure glaucoma, which is picked up with this test. So it's always an important one to check, because the two can require sort of different treatment and management. So we need to, when we first see people, we need to establish whether it's an open angle or a closed angle, and that then informs what we do from then on. Pictometry also, you can see on the bottom right there, this is just a little gadget that uses ultrasound to measure the thickness of the cornea. So the cornea is just, it's a clear window at the front of the eye, and it's about 0.5 millimetre thick, but there's quite a lot of variation we've discovered. So it can be anything from about 400 microns up to about 700 micrometers. Both of those are sort of extremes and unusual, but they do happen. And the reason that measuring the thickness of the cornea is important is because we know that it can affect the measurement that we take of intraocular pressure. It can introduce an error into the pressure measurement. So it's important to know when we're looking at someone's pressure what the corneal thickness is, because it affects how we interpret it. And we also know from some big studies that have been done that generally the thicker your cornea is, the less likely you are to develop glaucoma, whereas with the thinner cornea, you're more likely to develop glaucoma. And it's not a guarantee. It's not everyone with a thin cornea is not going to get glaucoma, and some people with thick corneas do get glaucoma, but just when you look at the sort of statistics in the population overall, it does slightly adjust your chances. So it's something that we need to take into account. And the other thing we have here is photographs and OCT testing. So again, you'll be aware that sometimes after we've had a look at your eyes, you will be sent down to have either photographs taken, which is what we did in the past, or in more recent years, we have OCT scanning, which is what we'll get pictures of here. So the photographs of the optic nerve you can see are the red bits, just on the sort of top left of that photo there. And in the past, sort of 10 or 15 years ago, that's all we'd have done. We'd just have taken that photograph and we wouldn't have had any of this other information. But in more recent years, we've been able to use technology that measures the nerves at the back of the eye, the nerve fibre, which is what is affected and is damaged in glaucoma. And by taking measurements of those, we can sort of check them over time and see if they're getting any thinner, which again is a sign of glaucoma. So what that gives us are these sort of maps. Again, just measuring that thickness, and it's just more information. Looking at a photograph is really useful, and we can compare photographs from one visit to the next, but it's possible there could be sort of subtle changes that wouldn't necessarily show up in a photograph. So being able to take these measurements just gives us a slightly more accurate way sometimes of measuring things over time. So it's another tool that we have. And things like that, and the pachymetry that we talked about are tools that we didn't have, you know, sort of 20 years ago. We weren't really doing those things routinely, and you may well be aware yourself that the visual field tests have probably got a bit more sophisticated and maybe take a bit longer now. So a visit to the glaucoma clinic probably takes a bit longer than it used to, and partly that's because we keep, not we, I don't, but smart people keep coming up with new technology and new ways of doing things that are all really helpful, but everything takes more time, and there are more things that you need to think about, and that then makes everything a little bit more complicated. So I think if anyone has any questions, I'll take. There was the other thing that I was going to say. I can't remember where I was going to say it, but I seem to have missed it out. But one of the things that I'm aware of, having said quite a few times, is we're looking for change. You know, when we're doing the visual field test, we're looking for signs of change. When we're looking at the optic nerve, we're looking for signs of change. And glaucoma is a diagnosis of change. So when we're looking at these things, when you come for the first visit, we're looking to get a sort of baseline and see what everything looks like. But sometimes, I think this is maybe frustrating from a patient's point of view, we don't always have the answers at a first visit in a glaucoma clinic, because when you're looking at a progressive disease, which glaucoma is, when you're only seeing it once, you can't tell if it's got worse. And sometimes the only way to be sure if it's glaucoma or not is to watch it over time and to see if it gets worse. And that's not ideal as a patient, because you want to know, but sometimes we don't know. It's not simple, unfortunately, and it's one of these, like many things, the more you find out about it, the more complex you realise it is. So sometimes the best advice we can give to people is, we're not sure, there could be glaucoma there, but what we need to do is bring you back and gather more information. And that's not us fobbing you off, that really is us trying to do the best that we can, but it can be difficult sometimes. So anyway, I shall stop talking there. I think that's quite enough of my monologue. And if there's any questions, I will be happy to try to answer them.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was absolutely fantastic. Really, really detailed and interesting talk there about types of glaucoma tests that we have and why we have them. You know, often I think people, even though we might even be told at the time why we're having them, it doesn't necessarily stay in our brains, or maybe we're told too fast, or maybe we're not told at all. So actually empowering ourselves with understanding about why they're having them is so, so important. I've got some questions there. Please keep your questions coming in. If you could put them into the Q&A section, that's probably the best place to put them, and then I'm going to be able to see them there. I'm also going to be launching a second poll in a minute, and that just, as I said, enables us to know whether, you know, the kind of information that you've gained from this and whether it's been helpful or not. Okay, so the first question, this is actually one that came in earlier today, and this is to do with your Acuity tests. And a gentleman wrote to us today and said he's had an Acuity test with a light on, and he's had an Acuity test with a light off. And he says they both come out with different results. And his concern is, because Acuity tests are so important and influence things like driving, should it be one way or the other? Should it be in the dark, in the light? You know, what's the kind of right way of doing it?
So they're typically done with lights on. We're always taught to record it with lights on. I wouldn't record a visual acuity with lights off unless there was a very specific reason to do it. And I can't really think of any glaucoma related reasons to do it. There are some eye conditions that affect people's vision more in bright light than in dim light, things that affect the retina, and some of those people just can't see in the lights but can see in the dark. So in some specific circumstances we might do it. Even then, I would probably do both just for the comparison, because I think that the standard test with the lights on is still useful information, even if it is just to record that it was very poor. That's still useful information to have, and the fact that if it is better with the lights off, then that's also useful. But generally we recorded with the lights on. In terms of influencing driving, the legal driving standard refers to, there's a couple of legal standards. The visual acuity test, where you need to be able to see a certain line on the chart, and there's the number plate, and the number plate test specifies in good daylight. So for that reason, I would be looking to take any measurements for driving with the lights on, because I think that's what the driving standard is based on.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you very much. Second question we have in, what impact do cataracts or growing cataracts have on the results of a visual field test?
Oh, good question. I don't have an example here, but what tends to happen is a cataract sort of dulls down your vision overall across the whole of the eye, whereas glaucomatous visual field defects, like we looked at there, tend to affect quite specific pockets and specific areas. So what you'll find is that as a cataract develops, all of the lights will have to be a bit brighter for you to see them. So all the numbers get shifted, but the sort of glaucoma changes can still be seen because they're little sort of dips, little variations. So it does make the test more difficult to do. It can cause an overall reduction in the numbers, but the machine and hopefully the people interpreting the test like me are usually able to pick that out, so we can see the differences from cataract. We can kind of ignore them and concentrate on what's coming from the glaucoma, but they can affect it.
That's really useful, thank you. Okay, I've got someone here who's talking about the use of handheld tonometers. They're saying that are they as accurate? And this person finds them quite stressful. Is that something you find common?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, there's a few different handheld versions, some sort of newer ones these days that are used. Some people prefer them. You know, some people don't like having to sit in the position on the microscope where you're having to sit with your chin in the rest, and the handheld ones get around that. So some people do find them easier. Some of the handheld ones are designed to be used without anaesthetic, and again, some people prefer that. In terms of accuracy, they're all, most modern tonometers are fairly accurate, no matter what type they are. They tend to give good repeatable readings, but generally what we would say is that we want to be measuring with the same one consistently. You can't really compare one to the other, so you can compare each one to itself over time, but if we're seeing people back, probably the most important thing is that we use the same one each time to know if there's fluctuations in the pressure. One of the other things about the handheld ones, or some of them, is that they can be used, some of them are designed to be used by a patient at home, which is something that's started to happen in some places. Patients can be taught how to use them, and they can go home and they can take sort of regular pressure readings over a 24-hour period or that sort of thing. So that's something that's maybe starting. It's one of the advantages of a handheld one that you don't get with the equipment that we use. So that's something to consider. But overall, I think the most important thing is that we're using them consistently.
That's great. Hopefully that's answered that one then. I've got a question here about pseudo-exfoliation glaucoma, and basically wanting to know what it looks like when you're looking at it.
Oh, I wish I could find you a picture. I'm sure I have some, but it would take me too long to find them. It looks like, so when we look at the lens of the eye, which is normally clear, it looks, it's a terrible description, but this is how it's usually described. It looks like dandruff. It looks like little flakes. Oh, so where you've got a lens that's normally clear, you just get little white sort of flaky bits sitting around it in a kind of circular, sort of jagged circular pattern. They tend to be sort of irregular around the edge. So yeah, it looks like the lens of your eye has a little bit of dandruff sitting on the front of it.
That sounds not, I don't know if that sounds nice at all, but very descriptive, very descriptive. I've got a question here that's been liked by a few people on Zoom, and it's about the relationship between dry eye and glaucoma. Do you see this increasing with people with glaucoma? Do they tend to suffer more with dry eye? Is it something people talk about?
Yes, I think it's probably less associated with glaucoma than it is with glaucoma treatment. Did someone else do a webinar on this? Do you have it? Did someone or someone? I thought it was a webinar.
Yeah, we had.
So that might be something. Yeah, I thought I'd seen something about that, but yeah, it's a big issue. Using eye drops regularly, as many of our glaucoma patients do, especially eye drops with preservatives in them, often causes a degree of sort of irritation of the ocular surface, and that can then cause dry eye. So often I think it's the treatment rather than the glaucoma that causes it, but it is an issue, and we do end up, some of our patients end up on preservative-free drops for that reason, to try and sort of help it a wee bit, although sometimes the medication itself can still cause problems, so it's not all the preservative, and we end up with people using sort of dry eye lubricating medications alongside their glaucoma medications just for relief. The other thing that's worth noting is that glaucoma and dry eye are both, don't all throw things at me, but they're both diseases of aging. So they're both things that you're more likely to get independently as you get older. So it's not a huge coincidence that we see more dry eye in patients with glaucoma. But I think that the treatment definitely exacerbates that.
And we, as you very rightly said, we did a seminar 2 weeks ago, or a webinar 2 weeks ago, about dry eye, and that's going to be available to watch. But it is already on our Facebook, but it will also be on our website, hopefully within the next 2 weeks. So if anyone's particularly concerned about dry eye, it's definitely worth watching that webinar back. I've got someone here who's just asked for a little bit more information about the quadrants in your last slide. I'm not sure if we can get to that.
Oh, that was the OCT. Shall I share it again and we can have a look? So
that would be great.
A lot going on there. Let me see. So yeah, I'm not quite sure which one. There's lots of different bits on here. Down at the bottom, we have these sort of quadrants and also clock hours here. We have a little sort of map. So again, on the left, we have a normal retinal nerve fibre layer. So everything's green. They make things simple for simple creatures, and they give us a traffic light system to make it easy. So green means good, yellow means not too sure, and red means it's not good. So on the left here, all the quadrants are green. That suggests that the retinal nerve fibre layer around the whole sort of perimeter of the optic nerve is healthy and is of a normal thickness for the patient's age, race and sex. And on the other side here, it's a bit more questionable. So again, we've got a couple of red quadrants, we've got some yellow quadrants. There's a bit more concern, and basically the thinner it is, the more likely it is to flag up. So this would suggest that there's potentially thinning of the nerve fibres, which is something that we can see in glaucoma. So we don't rely 100% on any single test, but this would certainly prompt us to have a good look at the other tests and a good look at the optic nerve to see if there was indeed glaucoma in that one. So I'm not quite sure if that's what you were asking. If not, fire another question and I'll try again.
And I've got a Facebook comment here that's coming from Facebook, and it's a comment really saying extra thick corneas affect the accuracy of handheld tonometers, I believe.
They affect the accuracy of all tonometers. Well, but that's maybe not. There are some sort of newer tonometers that are, we don't have one yet actually, but there are some modern ones that are just coming out in the last few years that can sort of mitigate for the effect of corneal thickness, but in general the Goldman tonometer is used mostly in the eye clinic, and a lot of the handheld ones as well are affected by corneal thickness.
That's excellent. I'm going to launch the second poll now, just so people know. We may have a few more questions. If I can encourage anyone else who has any more questions to put them into the Q&A box. We have time for a couple more. But then we will obviously have to finish off. So if there is any more, please stick them in now, and I will have a wee looky if anything else comes through. And yes, please fill in that second poll if you can. Let me have a wee check. How many tests do you think, Lisa, a year do you kind of get through when we're not in COVID times? I mean, it must be a very busy place. We know eye hospitals are ridiculously busy. So
how many patients would I see, do you mean? Or
yeah, during kind of a normal non-COVID year-ish.
Oh goodness. I'm trying to think. We probably have, not me personally, but we probably have 6 or 7 glaucoma clinics running a week with, in normal times we would see about 10 on each clinic, so that's about 70 a week. Someone doing that. So yeah,
that's
1,000, something like that. In Falkirk, yes. So yeah, certainly a good few thousand. And Falkirk's a relatively small area. It'll depend on your sort of health board area as well, but big numbers. And this is one of the things that we know with glaucoma, and particularly when people look at the stats for this, again, I feel like you really should throw tomatoes at me, but because we have an aging population, sorry, glaucoma patients, but the reality is that we're seeing more and more glaucoma. Because as people live longer, more people are getting glaucoma. The people who have glaucoma are surviving longer and are needing treated for longer with glaucoma, and then they need appointments at the eye clinic. So it's a bit of a snowball, really, and I don't think that's going to go away. So it's something that we need to think about, is that we make sure that we're still able to provide care for these people as the numbers go up.
Absolutely, and there's a question here coming in from Facebook, and it says, do you think that tests will change in the future?
I can't see how they won't. If I look at how they've changed over the 20 years that I've been doing this, it's been huge. And if I look back at the 20 years before that, there's a big change there as well, so that there's no reason to think that they won't continue to change. Hopefully, they'll improve by sort of getting better and more efficient. I think what we need to not do is just keep adding more and more things in. So I think we need to work on that and doing the right test at the right time. And I think the other thing across the whole of eye care really is whether there's some degree of sort of computerization or you know, sort of using technology to help us a wee bit as well to make things better. And I think that's something that's coming in. It's already started really with at least OCT tests where we're taking measurements and things and using those rather than us just looking at optic nerves and things. So that's already there, but I think we're already more reliant on sort of measurements and computerized analysis, and it may be that there's more to be done down that line, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's always a wee bit scary when we start handing things over to machines, but I think there's a lot of benefits there. People are fallible to some extent, and I think sometimes automating things can be a positive in that way. So yeah, we'll see, but I'm sure there will be changes.
Excellent. And probably, I think we're probably close to getting to the last question. Just to let people know, if we haven't had a chance to get to your question, there may be two reasons. Firstly, because we've just had so many wonderful questions in. Secondly, if your question is specific, if it's in regards to drops or issues you're having with a particular surgery, this might not be the best forum to be able to answer those questions. But we do suggest that you contact our helpline service, open Monday to Friday, 9:30 till 5. They'll be able to help you one-to-one support there, and you'll be able to get more of a kind of one-to-one service that may be able to answer your question there. Just one we have here, obviously there's people that need to go for, that's talking about going for a visual field test at Specsavers for their driving. Why do you have to go for two, they say? You know, is it testing different parts of your visual field?
Yes, the driving test is a very specific one that is designed to, it basically maps the exact visual field that you're required to have to drive a car. So there's a specific sort of 20 degrees above and below and a certain extent of the visual field that you have to have. So it maps that out to see it. And the driving visual field test you do with both eyes together because that's how you drive. So it's just it's performing a different function to the visual field test that we're doing for glaucoma. It's actually less detailed as well. The driving test is really only interested in, can you see the light or can you not? Whereas when we're looking for glaucoma, it's one eye at a time, and it's, can you see this slightly bright light? Can you see this light that's a little bit dimmer? And it's a bit more detailed, so it's a different test altogether.
That's absolutely wonderful. Thank you. Yes, there's always lots of questions about the visual field test that we have to do for driving. I think sometimes we run talks about driving specifically as well. So look out for those people. If you are interested in that specifically, do look out for that. Right. Okay, Lisa, I think we're probably at a point where we've exhausted lots of questions. As I said, if you have asked something but we haven't managed to answer it in this forum, don't be disheartened. Please call our helpline if it's something that you feel that you need answering. And I just want to kind of wrap up here, really. First of all, I'd like to say thank you so much, Lisa, for coming to talk to us today. Much appreciated. Just a bit of information, really, kind of follow-up information for people who've joined us today. We hope you found it useful. On this slide is details about how to contact us. As I said, if we haven't been able to answer your question, we definitely will on here. Please consider completing the survey that we'll do a Survey Monkey afterwards, and it's really useful for us to know what's worked and what we need to improve. Our next digital support group will be taking place in 2 weeks on the 26th of November, and we're going to be talking about disaster response in glaucoma, the COVID story. So if you want to register for that session or any more of the sessions, we're going to keep advertising them, that we're looking at getting them every 2 weeks on a variety of subjects. Please visit our website, www.glaucoma.uk. Once again, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and that will be the end of our seminar today.